Yo, people. Hello, history buffs, hype fanatics, and religious fanatics? Yeah, you heard right. Today, we're diving into the past to dig up a guy who was so wild, they're still talking about him. Forget all your influencers, bloggers, and TikTokers. In just a couple of years, this guy not only managed to gather millions of followers, but also genuinely changed his city. And so wildly that it still sparks debate. We're talking about Girolamo Savonarola. Sounds like the name of some Italian dessert, right? But believe me, it was anything but sweet with him. He was a Dominican friar from the 15th century who came to Florence and stirred up such a commotion that Miley Cyrus, with her outrageousness, just pales in comparison. Imagine the mid-Renaissance Florence, the center of the world, a mecca of art, beauty, luxury, and, let's face it, all the most sinful pleasures. A golden age. Leonardo da Vinci was hanging out there, Michelangelo was carving his masterpieces, the Medicis were running the show. And then he appears, thin, with burning eyes, obsessed with the idea that everyone around was mired in sin and that it was high time for everyone to immediately repent. Doesn't sound very fun? Yeah, that's what the Florentines thought at first, too. But Savonarola wasn't just a boring preacher. He had a talent for speaking in a way that gave people goosebumps, a talent for persuading, a talent for igniting, and, strangely enough, a talent for predicting the future. Well, or at least for issuing predictions that suspiciously often came true. And so, in a very short time, this guy turned the most fashionable capital in the world into, well, you're about to be amazed, into a city where people voluntarily burn their books, paintings, expensive clothes, and jewelry. Yes, you heard right. Huge bonfires of luxury items and art right in the squares. He called it the Bonfire of the Vanities. Sounds like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie where survivors burn everything that reminds them of a cursed past. But this was real, in the very heart of the Renaissance. How could something like this even happen? How could a single monk turn an entire city upside down? A city that was synonymous with freedom and hedonism. To understand this, we need to immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the late Quattrocento, when outward beauty concealed a not-so-pleasant underside. And Savonarola had the balls to state it directly, for which, naturally, he received a lot of, well, you get the picture. Here's the English translation of your text. For this, he garnered immense hatred from some and fierce support from others, those who were genuinely shocked by the depravity and corruption. Yes, indeed. Besides all this beauty, Florence was also a hotbed of intrigues that made Game of Thrones look tame. The Medici, though patrons of the arts, held on to their power with an iron fist, stopping at nothing. The Vatican, well, you can imagine what the papacy in the 15th century was like. That's a separate story about spiritual leaders indulging to the fullest. And amidst all this lawlessness, Savonarola's sermons, calling for repentance and asceticism, suddenly became incredibly relevant. Savonarola didn't just preach from the pulpit. He was like a DJ who dropped the perfect track. He hit the most painful points. Protest against luxury that was turning into gluttony and debauchery. Protest against the moral decay of the church. Protest against the tyranny of the Medici, who, in his opinion, did nothing but corrupt the people. And the people flocked to him. At first, they were just crowds of gawkers, then fans, and then a whole army of his followers who called themselves mourners of sins. Imagine, Savonarola begins to speak, and the city becomes paralyzed. People drop everything to listen to him. His sermons weren't just sermons. They were a show, a stand-up, a rap battle with sin. He spoke simply, passionately, and most importantly, he spoke about what people felt but were afraid to utter aloud. He spoke of injustice, of how wealth doesn't make a person holy, and of how one needs to return to true values. And most importantly, he predicted troubles if sin was not eradicated. And what do you think? He didn't just predict, he started to act. First, verbal appeals. Then, pressure on the authorities. Eventually, the Medici, after the expulsion of Piero de' Medici in 1494, lost control of Florence. And then Savonarola, leveraging his authority and popular support, virtually came to power. Not as a ruler, no. He was a spiritual leader, but his word became law. Florence transformed into a theocracy, where morality, dictated by one man, reigned supreme. It was during this period that the infamous bonfires of the Vanities took place. It wasn't simply Savonarola coming out and saying, "Let's burn everything." It was the culmination of his rule. Here's the English translation of the provided text. Children, armed with crosses, went from house to house, collecting sinful objects. Frivolous paintings, mirrors, gambling cards, expensive clothes, musical instruments. Imagine the reaction of people like Botticelli, who was then at the peak of his career, and rumor has it, even threw his own paintings into the fire. Although this is most likely a myth, because the artist was still too good and cherished his canvases. But the point is that the atmosphere in the city was such that resisting was simply dangerous. You were either with Savonarola or you were a sinner who would go down with your vices. It got to the point where Florence became, well, completely different. Taverns closed, gambling was banned, prostitution went underground. The streets, which used to be full of joy, laughter, and entertainment, became quiet, pious, prayerful, some would say boring. It was as if you had suddenly found yourself not in the cradle of the Renaissance, but in some strict monastery. But not everything could be smooth. It's one thing to scare the people, another to keep them in obedience. Sermons are good, but hungry stomachs and the absence of usual entertainment are something else entirely. And not everyone liked having their lives dictated by a monk. This was especially disliked by those accustomed to power and luxury, namely Pope Alexander VI and the remaining influential families. Savonarola overplayed his hand, daring to challenge not only Florentine society, but also the Pope himself. And here he was met with something undeniable. And here he was met with something undeniable. Pope Alexander Fairs, that same Borgia who was famous for his banquets and tumultuous personal life, was, to put it mildly, not thrilled by Savonarola's sermons. At first, he tried to negotiate peacefully, offered a cardinal's hat, tried to appease him. But Savonarola was unyielding. He considered the Pope the embodiment of evil and promised him divine punishment. Well, at this point, of course, the Pope's patience ran out. Insulting His Holiness and even calling for his dethronement, this was no longer just a sermon, it was a direct challenge. The Pope excommunicated Savonarola from the Church, which in the 15th century was a serious sentence. It wasn't just, "Oh, you're excommunicated." It meant you were an outlaw, outside God's grace, and your word was worthless. But Savonarola did not give up. He continued to preach, declaring that the Pope had no right to excommunicate him because he himself was steeped in sin. In short, the conflict escalated. At this time, unrest also began in Florence. People, of course, were initially delighted with the purity and piety, but gradually began to yearn for the good old days. The economy also suffered. Tourism and trade were in decline when all entertainment was banned. Drunkenness and debauchery brought in money, no matter how you looked at it. And the Pope's ultimatums hung over the city like a Damocles sword. If Florence did not get rid of Savonarola, it would face an interdict, a complete excommunication of the entire city from the Church, which was a serious matter. Add to this the opposition within Florence. Former supporters of the Medicis, aristocrats, merchants, all those who disliked the new ascetic Florence rubbed their hands together. They waited for the moment to strike. And so, when the papal threat became too real and popular discontent simmered, their hour struck. They began actively spreading rumors, inciting the people, playing on fears and grievances. In short, Savonarola found himself in a very delicate situation. His authority, which had once been unshakable, began to melt before their eyes. Some of his closest associates began to doubt. Some openly betrayed him. And to top it all off, an incident occurred that completely undermined faith in him. One of the Franciscan monks, an opponent of Savonarola, challenged him to an ordeal by fire to prove his righteousness and divine patronage. Savonarola initially agreed, but then began to prevaricate. He sent his supporter in his place and then canceled the ordeal altogether due to rain. The people who had gathered to watch this fiery show were disappointed and angry. This was a powerful blow to his image. Instead of divine confirmation, people saw cowardice, or at least uncertainty. That's when it all started. The city, which had recently worshipped Savonarola, began to turn away from him. The streets, once filled with his loyal followers, were now full of disgruntled and angry people. The authorities, under pressure from the Pope and the indignant crowd, were forced to act. It was impossible to stop the flywheel that Savonarola himself had set in motion. The people broke into the San Marco monastery where Savonarola was hiding. He was seized, thrown into prison, and tortured. Yes, even spiritual leaders were not spared in those times. Under torture, he confessed to everything he was accused of: heresy, false prophecies, and conspiracy against the Pope. Here's the English translation of your text. True, he later recanted his words, claiming that under torture one could confess to being a dragon. But who listened to him? He was subjected to a show trial, sentenced to be hanged and burned. On May 23, 1498, Girolamo Savonarola, along with two of his closest associates, was executed in Piazza della Signoria, the same place where once the bonfires of the Vanities burned. More precisely, they were first hanged and then set alight, so that no trace remained. Their ashes were scattered over the Arno River, so no one could collect them as relics. Thus ended the story of a man who wanted to change the world, but was crushed by it himself. What can we take from Savonarola's story? First, even the best intentions can lead to very unpredictable consequences. He wanted to cleanse Florence of sin, but in essence, he provoked an economic crisis and societal division. When you try to forcibly impose ideals on people, no matter how right they seem, it rarely ends well. People don't like being told how to live. Second, power is a dangerous thing. Savonarola gained immense power over the minds and hearts of people, but he couldn't manage it. He didn't notice how he transformed from a prophet into a dictator who demanded unquestioning obedience. And history teaches us, when someone promises to build paradise on earth, be on your guard. Very often, such a paradise turns into hell, and dissenters are burned at the stake. And third, the crowd is a fickle thing. Today, it adores you, and tomorrow, it's ready to tear you apart. Remember that the people who were shouting Hosanna yesterday can scream, "Crucify him!" tomorrow. And this applies not only to medieval Florence, but to any era, including our own. Savonarola's story is a powerful lesson in how easy it is to lose balance, how important it is to maintain critical thinking and not to be swayed by beautiful words, even if they sound very convincing. He was a man of his era, but his story is relevant today. After all, even now, there are those who promise mountains of gold if we only give up our desires and follow them. So, my friends, learn from the mistakes of the past. Be smarter than the crowd. And don't burn bridges, even if you really want to build something better in their place. Savonarola tried, but in the end, he himself was consumed by the fire of his own ambitions. I hope this story has made you think. Subscribe to the channel, leave comments. See you soon.